Everyone, welcome to Third Thursdays with Tom and Tim. I'm Tim Nutt.
I'm Tom Dillard, and we're happy to have you with us tonight as we discuss matters associated with Arkansas history, culture, and other aspects of our state story. Tonight, we're talking about the importance of and the history of the German influence in Arkansas as it pertains, and especially as it pertains to one of the newspapers that they had here.
There's been a lot of German presence in Arkansas for a long time.
Yes, there has been, but it has never been a really large number of immigrants. In 1860, we had 1,143 German-born Arkansans. That was 0.4% of the state's population. So that's 1,100 or so. By 1900, 40 years later, it had only grown to about 6,000. So the population, the German population of the state was never large, but it was very interesting and quite diverse within that, Germans and Catholics and all kinds of interesting nuances to the German Arkansas story.
You had when was the first wave of German immigration? I guess that was the 1830s, wouldn't you say?
Well, of course, we got a certain number of people coming from the failed revolution of 1848, but and especially we got a number of Jewish German immigrants during that time. But really, the large number of Germans did not come until after the Civil War. But certainly there have been Germans in Arkansas ever since the state was established. Matter of fact, when Friedrich Gerstacker came here in 1838 and was here 1838 and 39, he visited a large number of German immigrants who were living in the state, stayed with them, talked about them.
And that was that first, the Germans that he visited during his first trip to Arkansas was a group of Germans that I believe came in 1832, 1833. Shirley Schutte, who is on tonight, she wrote about that in her master's thesis about that colony that came to Arkansas.
Shirley Schutte is really knowledgeable about the history of Germans in Arkansas. She's done a lot of work. Her master's thesis is an important product in Arkansas German history.
One of the families that were involved in that first German colony that came over in the early 1830s was Klingenhofer.
Yes.
Who eventually settled in Perry County at the confluence of the Fush and Arkansas rivers.
Perry County, the center of the universe.
It is the center of the universe. I don't know if y'all know that, but it is.
And he shows up quite often in Gerstacker's Wild Sports in the Far West.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really great book, and I've been trying to peddle that book for a long time. It was reprinted by Duke University Press back, I don't know, and sometime in the 1960s, and I bought it at that time, and it has been a source of a lot of interesting detail about antebellum Arkansas. It has been brought out, a number of Gerstacker writings have been reprinted in recent years, including some from the University of Arkansas Press.
Wasn't there a new book, a book published a few years ago? Kathleen Condray, who's our guest tonight, might be able to answer this question, but Chuck Adams, who used to be up at Fayetteville,
right,
and he and someone else, I think, did a new edition or annotated edition of
right.
Gerstacker's.
Yes, and that book is really worth having, and they did a good job with it. It's a great resource.
We have a comment that says, Kathleen, she says, Chuck Adams, former assistant dean of the Fulbright College, published a new edition of Deregulatorian in Arkansas.
Yes,
so another one of
his titles.
Yes, and then Don Bragg said that Gerstacker had a lot of great things to say about Arkansas forest at that time, which is interesting.
But Don Bragg is a scholar on forest history. He is I guess a professor of forestry down at, no, he's with the U.S. Forest
I
Service.
think, yes.
Anyhow, he's done a lot of work, a really great guy, and I think he'll be doing a lot more work in Arkansas history in the future.
You know, people think that German immigrants, that they think of immigrants coming from Germany or maybe Austria and some from Switzerland, but you know another country where they come from.
Would that be Liechtenstein?
It is Liechtenstein. Yes, it is. My family was from Liechtenstein, settled in Perry County.
Liechtenstein only sent 700 immigrants to the United States. And so, Tim, your family is a very tiny slice of immigrants from a German-speaking country. But I know that you have really enjoyed researching your family history and the connections to Liechtenstein.
We have. I'm going to share my screen here for a second and to show you a picture of, get past that. So this is, I just happened to have this on my computer, this picture of the center of Balzers, Liechtenstein. Balzers is the town where my family came from, immigrated in 1880. And in the center of the town is the castle, the fort on top of the mountain, Gutenberg, Castle Gutenberg, and then the church sits below the hill of it. So I've been fortunate to visit Liechtenstein twice. It's very interesting.
And you connected with family over there.
I did. I in the late 1980s, I started doing family history research. And
how old would you have been in the 1980s?
I would have been in my teens.
Mm-hmm. So you got interested in your family history pretty early.
I did.
You've been a nerd all your life.
I have been a nerd all my life. But I corresponded with my family in Liechtenstein for 20 years. And then in 2010, I finally went over and visited them.
I can remember that. And I remember you saying that one day they told you that you're going to get up early the next morning because they were going to drive you to the north of the country.
Right.
And you inquired as to how far that was, and they said,
well, I said, well, how long how long would that take? And they said 15 minutes. and so, Liechtenstein is only 12 miles long and it's 5 miles wide. So it doesn't take long to get from one end of the country to the other. Well,
of course, your German-speaking ancestors settled in Perry County.
Right.
But, and that's, of course, in the Arkansas River Valley. And that's where a large number of German immigrants to the state settled.
Right.
We know about Bishop Fitzgerald and the arrangement that he made with the railroad, the Little Rock and Fort Smith Railroad, setting aside lands to be sold specifically to German-speaking Catholic immigrants to Arkansas. Bishop Fitzgerald, that was really far-sighted on his part.
It was, and those German immigrants were really able to get a lot of land for relatively cheaply.
It must have been an eye-opening experience for these folks like your ancestors to come from the alpine regions of Europe and to be plopped down in the middle of Arkansas in a hot, humid August day. It must have been an eye-opening experience.
Well, the brochures that were put out by the railroads encouraging immigrants to come to Arkansas, they were not totally true in their description of Arkansas, because there was a few pamphlets that I've seen there, they would say there were no mosquitoes, no extreme heat, no extreme cold, warm, temperate climate all year round. So when my family came and settled at the confluences of those two rivers, low-lying area. You can imagine. I imagine in the summer they were not happy.
Yeah, I can recall reading a letter from a German-American soldier in the Union Army stationed in eastern Arkansas, and he was writing about the horrors of trying to sleep at night in the middle of the summer. And he was fortunate to have a mosquito bar to keep the mosquitoes at bay, but he said that also kept the breezes at bay. And so he had to choose between suffocating and mosquitoes. It had to be an extremely shocking experience for these folks who came from cool climates.
I think I would have chosen suffocation.
The Subiaco has been, we know a lot about Subiaco because there's been a book written about it. The book by Father Hugh Ossenmacher, A Place Called Subiaco. That's really a fine book. It's a hefty volume. It's got a lot of information, and I really recommend it to a lot of people. It's not just about the Abbey. It's not just about Subiaco itself. It has a lot more cultural history in it than you might expect.
It really talks about many of the German colonies that were along the Arkansas River Valley. Of course, New Dixie, where my family settled, is in there. It has to have a prominent place. But Altus and Atkins, all along the river valley. It's really a nice book. And actually, that book is in my top 10 of all-time favorite books about Arkansas.
Of course, Paris and the area in Logan County was really a center of German settlement. Large numbers of Germans settled there, and today it still has something of that. You can still tease out little hints about those places being settled by Germans even to this day.
Well, you have Wiedeker up by Altus.
Yes.
And of course they were Swiss, but they still have remnant of German immigration.
The Post family and others. By the way, if you're looking for a substitute for orange juice at breakfast, I'd like to recommend Post muscadine juice. The Post winery bottles muscadine juice, and it is so refreshing and such a nice change of pace at breakfast.
And also the restaurant that they have, the Weinkeller at Wiedeker Village, is really nice.
It is nice. I've eaten there a number of times, and I like it too.
Before we move to my book that I'm going to recommend, we didn't mention that there were also, besides German Catholics, there were also German Lutherans that came to Arkansas.
Yes, indeed. We had a goodly number of Lutherans who came. The Helsel family in Little Rock is an example of that German family, and that family played a major role in Arkansas history. Matter of fact, Germans in Little Rock really did have an impact on the capital city. We've had German mayors. We had Frederick Kramer. I think he was a mayor. He was also on the school board. There's a school named after Kramer. The building still exists. Adolphine Fletcher Terry, who is one of the great icons of Arkansas women's history, her maternal line was from the Kraus family, which was an early German immigrant family to Arkansas. It's also a little bit deceiving for us to talk just about the Arkansas River Valley. We should not do that. There were other places too. In Pulaski County, for example, there was a settlement called Germania, and it's in I guess you'd say, the southwestern part of the county. It's no longer called Germania because during World War II,
World War I, right?
excuse me, World War One. I'm sorry.
I don't have very many opportunities to correct you, especially on a recording. So
we'll talk about that later. Germania was forced to change its name during World War One. And they were not only forced to change the name, Tim, but they were forced to rename the place Vimy Ridge, which was a French victory in the war. So they were forced to change the name of the town, and then they were forced to take a name which was really pretty demeaning, I would say, pretty demeaning treatment of our German citizens. Of course, we know it went way beyond that. A lot of the German-speaking churches in Arkansas dropped their German sermons. At First Lutheran Church in Little Rock, the minutes of various meetings were kept in German until World War One. It was a tough time for Catholics and Germans, Catholic Germans, as well as Protestant Germans in Arkansas during World War One.
But it is interesting before the war, and the research that I've done, the German community in New Dixie didn't seem to have any trouble with during World War, either war about being German. Of course, by World War II, their German culture pretty much vanished. But it's interesting that in Little Rock, I'm just speaking of that because they used to have German Day here in Little Rock. I know in the early 1900s.
Right. Well, the largest bank in Arkansas at one time was German National Bank of Little Rock. Existed from 1875 to 1930. Charles Prenzel was Charles Penzel, Penzel was president of that bank and a leading businessman in Little Rock. That bank, the Fletcher family, which was related to the Krause family, was also important in the German bank hierarchy.
Well, and you mentioned other places besides Arkansas River Valley. Of course, you have to mention Northeast Arkansas with Jonesboro and Pocahontas and Paragould, with Eugene Bible setting up German colonies there. And then up in Northwest Arkansas, you had Simon Sager, one of the early German settlers up there. And then wasn't there the Herman family?
The Herman family of Western Washington County. That's a sad story. Hermansburg, I think that was the name of their settlement. They had a large mill there, and they were Unionists. They didn't want to get involved during the Civil War, as most Germans did not want to, but they were forced to flee the area. And one of the saddest commentaries that I've ever read in Arkansas history was a diary entry written by one of the female members of the Herman family. As they were leaving Northwest Arkansas, they camped on Christmas Eve. They camped just outside of Fayetteville, and she wrote a very poignant entry in her diary about what a sad Christmas it was to be forced to move and to give everything up.
I think the Washington County Historical Society, they had a publication about the Hermans of Hermansburg. I don't know if that's still available, but that's the history of that community.
We should also I want to mention Carolyn Lemaster's book, A Corner of the Tapestry, is a monumental study, practically an encyclopedia of Judaism in Arkansas. And a large percentage of the Jews who immigrated to Arkansas came from Germany and other German-speaking places. And this book by Carolyn Lemaster Tim, you were saying earlier that the Ossenmacher book was on your top 10 list.
Mm-hmm.
As far as what's shelved for ready access in my office, I have a shelf of things that I frequently make reference to, and a corner of the tapestry is so thorough that if you're interested in anything that touches on the history of Judaism, that's the place to go. It's a really wonderful book, and a lot of those Jewish immigrants who came to Arkansas in the 19th century were German speakers.
And that book's still available from the University of Arkansas Press.
Yes, that's one of the great things about the U of A Press is they keep titles in print for a good while.
I know we're talking about Germans, but I also there are two books that I want to mention. Staying in the German about the German immigrants. Ken Barnes did a book back in the 1990s, I guess, early 2000s, The Guiding Star for the St. Joseph Colony. And St. Joseph Colony was another one of those planned colonies. Interestingly, that the St. Joseph's Colony was supposed to be multi-ethnic. So the Marche was supposed to be for the Polish immigrants, and then Conway and Morrilton were Germans, and Atkins was supposed to be German. But Morrilton was also supposed to have a French settlement there.
And I know nothing about that. That's a little known. Did it ever come to pass?
No. Of course, Marche.
Well, of course, Marche.
But the French, there were never any French immigrants, as far as I could tell, ever came to Morrilton. But that would be interesting to have that French influence in Morrilton. Mm-hmm. It could be called Le Morriton. And then also, of course, there's another one of my favorite books is up on the screen is A Farewell to Famine, and it's not about German immigrants, it's about Irish immigrants, and it was another the early Irish colony that was to be established in Fort Smith in the 1850s, before even Fitzgerald came over, so became bishop. So it was a failed colony as well. But this is a really interesting book, and another interesting thing is it's by Jim Rees, and it's not the same Jim Rees that we know.
Yes, Jim Rees is very active. The Jim Rees we know is active in Arkansas anthropology,
but
archaeology.
He was pleased, though, to know that I liked a book by him, even though it wasn't by him.
Was it, before we move on, wasn't there another Irish colony supposed to take place in the Arkansas River Valley?
And yes, and actually it was supposed to be in Perry County. Perry again, center of the universe. Between straddled Perry and Yell County, it was St. Patrick's Colony, and that was in the 1880s. Interestingly, at the same time that the German colony, St. Boniface Colony on the eastern end of Perry County, was being established, the Irish Colonization Society was establishing the St. Patrick's Colony on the western side of Perry County. But they brought in a few people, but it never got started really off the ground either. But the interesting thing about St. Patrick's Colony is it was not so much bringing Irish from Ireland over to Arkansas. It was bringing Irish immigrants that were already in the larger cities on the East Coast in Boston and New York, bringing them from these crowded cities to Arkansas.
And that's a good segue, actually, to the point that needs to be made that many of the Germans who came to Arkansas after the Civil War did not come here directly. A large number of them, including your family, I believe, settled in places like Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, places that had large German populations, and then they came south. This was true also of the Protestants who settled on the Grand Prairie, the Protestant German settlers. You know
where the largest group of Liechtensteiners are in the United States?
Where would that be?
Dubuque, Iowa. Dubuque, Iowa.
And how many would that be?
Probably
a few hundred.
Probably. Well, I think we're ready for our guest tonight, and I'm happy. I'm glad that we have Dr. Kathleen Condray here today or tonight. She is an associate professor of German at the University of Arkansas, and she's done all this work into the German experience in Arkansas, particularly on the Arkansas Echo, which was a German language newspaper, one of the German language newspapers in Arkansas. So I am going to stop sharing my screen, and then Kathleen, if you would come on.
Hello.
Yes, we can't, oh, there you are. Okay, I see.
Am I in the corner?
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book.
I love the book. The book is so great.
Thanks.
And I am fiddling right here.
Well,
okay, there you are.
Fiddling, why don't you pass me the book and I will talk about the book.
Okay.
Das Arkansas Echo, brought out by the University of Arkansas Press. It's a year in the life of Germans in the 19th century South, the subtitle, which really does what tells you what the book is about, but it's also about a lot more than just that. One of the things that I really like about this is that you included an appendix in which you put many of the families. You listed the families who came here, and that's a great tool to have. Welcome to our show. We're glad to have you, and we have a little bit of background together. When Tim and I were at the University of Arkansas Special Collections, we talked with Kathleen and urged her to take a look at Arkansas German history, and now here we are. This book is in hand, and we're really tickled about it. And we're also expecting great things from you in the future.
Well, I appreciate that. And before I forget, I want to mention there are also 2 other appendices that are available online. We wanted to keep the price of the book low, so there's an appendix that has a list of all of the companies that advertised in the Echo, and then all of the mostly Democratic candidates they endorsed for political office. So hopefully that can also be helpful to other researchers. But I will never forget that meeting in your office, Tom, because I think Tim at one point just kind of threw out there, well, you know, there were 3 German language newspapers in Arkansas, and I had been on the faculty here since 1999. And that meeting was probably around 2013, 14, and I had never heard of this. So that was really a fantastic tip. And then I got in touch with the wonderful monks at Subiaco, who kept every single issue from 1891 through 1932. They still have every single one because, of course, they came from Switzerland, and the community was made of German speakers for decades and decades. That was the language they spoke. So that was also really nice to be able to have those physical copies. We do have copies of the Echo that are microfilm, but as those of us who are old enough to remember microfilm know, it is not the most pleasant thing to read for hours on end. And since I spent about 8 months reading every single issue from the inaugural year, I was extremely happy to have the actual copies.
I remember when you were in special collections looking at those those bound volumes, and I was in my office, and occasionally I'd hear an excited yelp from you about something that you had found in the Echo. What was well, first give us a brief summary of the Echo, and then but then I'd like to know what were some of your favorite discoveries.
Absolutely. Right. So at the time of its founding, and I should say the first issue is very technically from 1891, but it was kind of a mini issue because of a newspaper feud it had with one of the other existing newspapers. And we can talk more about that later if there's time. But it ran essentially then from 1892 through 1932. And they had a self-reported circulation of around 1,500 subscribers. And we all know that could be inflated, but also people frequently would subscribe and then pass it around. So they likely had more readers than that. It was about $2 an issue, sorry, not an issue, $2 a subscription for the year. And that was roughly the same cost as other newspapers of its size. They were a newspaper that was largely associated with Karl Meurer, who was one of the first editors. He kind of traded duties with Fred Hohenschutz, who was actually his father-in-law that first year. But then after that, the newspaper became so associated with Meurer that he was known throughout the state as Der Echo-Mann. Like, people just knew that that was the guy who did the newspaper. It is astonishing to me that it survived through World War I. Really, its downfall was because Meurer died, and then his son did try to take over it briefly, but was not successful. So then that was the end of the newspaper. But fascinating that they were able to keep it going that long in a time when, I gotta say, part of my problem as a researcher is Germans did a great job assimilating. So my family, similar to yours, did not move directly to Arkansas. My granddad moved to Cincinnati first, followed railroad work down to Arkansas. And so, of course, he was a native speaker, but second and third generations in my family did not speak German. I'm third generation. I had to learn German from scratch so that I could talk to my relatives who still live in Germany. And so, you know, the problem is we just don't have a lot of those kinds of, you know, letters or that kind of thing that people saved. So that's why the Echo to me was really a treasure. It's a chance to read what the German immigrants thought about Arkansas life at the time, and in their own words, because we have a lot of terrific scholarship in Arkansas history about everything, really. And I'm sure everyone in this audience is familiar with the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, but it's such a great treasure. And so, you know, there's been a lot written about Germans, but there were also kind of some misperceptions because people were looking at them from the outside, right? For example, oh, they were all kind of ignorant. They all just wanted to stick together. And that is not what we see in the Echo. They were extremely well read. You know, this is just your little weekly newspaper, and they're talking about philosophy and science and, you know, oh, by the way, you know, as Pliny the Elder said, and they would quote things in Latin and just assume everybody in the audience or the reading audience also spoke Latin. They were really interested in commerce. And that was something, I can't remember what researcher, someone said they kind of were not too smart and would get hoodwinked occasionally. Could absolutely be true for individual communities, but you know, the people who were publishing and reading the Echo were interested in developments in the state in terms of, you know, what kind of mining was going on, new factories that were being opened, labor unrest. There was a lot of advice for people who were small businessmen. You need to have this kind of a license from the city of Little Rock to be able to sell this good. You need to make sure you pay your property taxes, and this is where you do it. So that was interesting. It was a lot of fun kind of getting a glimpse into their daily life. You know, they're talking about some things that are not known to them, like popcorn or the strange thing called pie crust, which they didn't even bother to translate into German. They just kind of Germanified it. They called it pie kruste, because you don't have pie in German-speaking countries even to this day. And so it was kind of fun to see what they were saying, you know, this is how you can make a pie crust, or here's this plant called rhubarb, which rhabarber also exists in Germany, but, you know, that you could also put that in pies. And then I would say an interesting but very depressing thing was race relations during this time. Karl Meurer's daughter, Mary, was interviewed in the 1970s. And thank you, Tim, because you told me about that interview. And she basically said there wasn't anything, you know, the German community, we weren't interested in race. We kind of kept to our little community and we didn't know anything about the Black community. And that is just absolutely not the case. You know, you've got all of this talk of when you're selecting a farm, you need to be careful who your neighbors are. Like, you don't want Black neighbors because they were pretty sure there was going to be a race war. They pick up on some of the extremely prejudiced attitudes of the English language press. And you can see that in the kinds of words they're using, because throughout the Echo, if they don't have a word for something, they will either just use the English word or they will try to Germanify it. So you can see in some of those words they use to talk about race that they're reading the English language papers, they're picking up on those racist attitudes. They were wholly unconcerned about the fact that the Democrats in that era of post-Reconstruction were using lying, stealing, and murder to take back control, and that a lot of Black voters were being disenfranchised. They knew that was happening, but they were worried about their own rights as voters. They did not try to stick up for their fellow Black Arkansans, and that was, of course, disappointing. They were really horrified by lynching. They commented about the fact that, you know, basically, what is wrong with Southerners? Why is this happening? You know, Tom, you mentioned the failed democratic revolution of 48. You know, they had really high hopes for coming to America, and this is a democratic ideal. And then they get here and there's all of this extra legal murder, and they just don't understand it. You know, at some point they said, okay, even if someone's guilty, that does not give a lynch mob the right to murder this person, to take justice into their own hands. So they do report on all of the horrific lynch murders that happened in 1892. But in one case, which was the Hampbisco family, which I'm sure a lot of you know about this case, a Black farmer, his wife, their 13-year-old son were all murdered. Pretty clearly a property dispute, you know, like there was money stolen from the family. And although the white papers were changing their story every 5 minutes to try to make it look like somehow the Black family was in the wrong, the German newspaper was like, no, that was a murder committed so you could rob them, and that's all there is to it. So it was interesting that you had just kind of these wide swings in terms of race. Like on the one hand, they were fearful, they were racist to some extent, but then they were also, you know, just not understanding a lot of what was going on.
Was there very much interchange between Catholic Germans and Lutheran Germans?
Good question. The Echo tried to have some kind of interchange. You know, Phil Dietzken, who ran the rival newspaper out of Little Rock, the Arkansas Staatszeitung, tried to paint them as the Catholic paper because that would make them not as relevant for the entire state, for all the German speakers in the state. They were really adamant about, no, you know, like the founders are Catholic, we're not a Catholic newspaper. And they would ask, you know, other denominations, if you have something, send it in. We would like to advertise your upcoming events, or if you have any news from your community. I cannot find any evidence in the Echo, at least in that inaugural year, that they were really in contact with the Germans in Stuttgart. I was going to say Stuttgart. Yeah, but then, you know, those Germans founded their own newspaper a year later called Germania. So, you know, maybe that's why they weren't so interested in kind of contributing to the Echo, because they were about to start their own newspaper.
Right.
Did you in that inaugural year, did you find any correspondence? Whether did Bishop Fitzgerald ever write anything into the Echo or about German immigration or anything like that? Was there any contact between, at least public contact in the newspaper, between the Catholic Church and the newspaper?
Catholic Church, absolutely. Lots of news about Eugen Weibel, you mentioned earlier, who was this missionary to Northeast Arkansas. They always report on his comings and goings. If he's going to Europe to bring back a new group of postulates from Switzerland, they report on it. You have Father Ajordui from Subiaco Abbey occasionally writing in with different notes. And other than that, they really are enamored of the bishop, and they cover his jubilee in a big front page story. But I didn't ever see that he was like writing in and corresponding with them directly.
So it was indeed not, it sounds like that not only was it not intended to be a Catholic paper, but that in fact, it was really not a Catholic paper.
I would say that.
It wasn't a house organ, that's for sure.
No, it wasn't the Guardian in German.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the correspondence, and that's one of the interesting things about the newspaper, about these community correspondents that did write in and talk about what was happening in their community. And there are a few newspapers today that still have that, where you know, so-and-so went and visited so-and-so. And so that's really interesting to me, that you have those glimpses into everyday life in the Echo.
Absolutely. And then going back to the topic of race relations, there was that series from Pocahontas written by Kind, who talks about the Ku Klux Klan. And, you know, Germans were, of course, targeted by the Ku Klux Klan, and he mentions one of those cases. But then he also apparently finds someone to interview who was a German who was maybe a member of the Klan. And so there's also this kind of not quite understanding. They thought, oh, the Ku Klux Klan was kind of like this good old boys club that got out of hand, and they compare it to the Famengerichte, which are these Vemic courts that also were vigilante justice that got out of control at the end of the Middle Ages, and condemned them, to be sure. They said, you know, the Ku Klux Klan is definitely a bad organization, and it was good that they were banned, but also with a little bit of sympathy towards them. So that was interesting.
So did the Klan attack all Germans or just Catholic Germans?
That's a great question. The incident that he mentions, it just says that one of the Germans was attacked, and it doesn't distinguish any further about maybe that was because he was Catholic or why.
Yeah.
But, you know, we know, and that was one of the major crusades of the year, was Prohibition, because they were really promised that they could pursue viniculture in Arkansas. And they talk about, we're going to have vineyards and produce wines that are equal to California. This is going to be like the new California in Arkansas. And they were bitterly disappointed when they got here and found all the 3-mile rules, and then were constantly fighting the mucker, or the Methodists, they called them mucker. And, you know, so that's another aspect of it.
You mentioned the 3-mile rule. For those who are watching who are not familiar with that, would you explain that?
Right. So the idea is you can't, they really looked at viniculture as a great solution to 2 problems in Arkansas. One is the over-reliance on cotton. They just could not believe how many people were planting cotton constantly. And they said, look, if we switch to wine production, then we're not so beholden to world cotton prices and all the problems that come with raising cotton. And it's also a good way to deal with excess produce. You can only eat so many grapes, right? Even if they are delicious muscadines. I agree. I love those too. But, you know, if you can turn those into wine, then you can keep them and you can sell them. And so the 3-mile laws, if they were within 3 miles of a church or a school, then they couldn't produce and sell wine from their farms the way they wanted to.
Early on, you mentioned the rivalry with the Stadtzeitung. Can you talk about that a little bit?
That was fascinating. And I thank Michael Dugan for his excellent book on community newspapers, because that's where I read about this for the first time. But as I mentioned, there were already 2 newspapers in Arkansas that were published in German at the time of the Echo's founding. The first was das Arkansas Volksblatt, which was published out of Fort Smith. And then there was the Arkansas Stadtzeitung, which was published out of Little Rock. And the editor of the Stadtzeitung really took it as a personal affront that this paper that had been kind of a local paper in Logan County, it was called Der Logan County Anzeiger, was reincarnated into this new newspaper called Das Arkansas Echo, because his paper, the English translation is the state's newspaper. So clearly they were moving in on his territory. And the very first issue published was a 1-page affair. And they explained that somebody, mysterious someone, had broken into their offices and basically ransacked the place and tore the frames apart so that they could not publish the issue that they had intended to. And, you know, like any fan of a murder mystery knows, there's a nice trail of blood to follow. And it just so happens that the Stadtzeitung had their offices in the same office building, and they could follow the trail of blood right back to the rival German newspaper's office. And, you know, then there were all these accusations back and forth, you know, Dietzken denied it. And basically throughout the whole year, there was feuding back and forth. At one point, Moyer slugged Dietzken, like they got into fisticuffs out in the street, and he of course got into trouble for that. So the kind of interesting thing about that is I was corresponding with Dan Durning, and he tracked Dietzken down after he left Little Rock. He went to I believe, Kansas City and started another German newspaper, and the same thing started up again. So when the people who are the editors and the correspondents for the Echo complain that, you know, Dietzken is just always wanting to stir up trouble for fun, there's a great word in German, Streithammer is like somebody who just mixes it up for fun, right? And that's apparently what Dietzken was. So, but yeah, it was not an auspicious beginning. So it's pretty amazing that they were able to survive their first year, much less go on for decades after that.
Well, fisticuffs among newspaper people were not unusual,
right?
Whether it was the German press or not, and even violence. You know, William E. Woodruff was attacked in his office early on. There were duels among newspaper editors. It was a time in which people took their newspapers seriously. And today, we're lucky to have newspapers.
Amen.
I want, before I have another question I want to ask you, but I want to remind the folks who are watching that if they have a question, they can use the chat feature. Here on Zoom and just type in your question into chat. Kathleen, you'll be able to see it, and I'll be monitoring the chat as well. So the Das Arkansas Echo, the book focuses on the inaugural year of the newspaper. So what are your plans after this? Do you plan on doing one for every year or every 5 years or whatever?
If you can guarantee me that I will live for another 75 years, yes, I will be right on that. No, but I am interested in what was going on in the Echo leading up to World War I. And I've done a little bit of preliminary research into that for a paper I did for the AHA conference. And Germans in Arkansas, just like Germans everywhere, had no idea that America was going to enter the war. And so there's a lot of talk in the Echo about, you need to be talking to your American friends and tell them, of course, how really awful and evil France and Britain are. And of course, America is going to want to support Germany as they've been unjustly attacked. And then when America entered the war, they did a lot of quick backpedaling. And they were like, no, we're good Americans. And look, we're buying war bonds. And so I found some evidence of that in the Echo. They also thought it was going to be a great recruiting tool because, you know, we were talking about the Hammond familia, and they, you know, knew from the 30 Years' War what was coming. If you're living in a place where there are marauding troops coming through, it's going to be bad news. And they assumed that a big inter-European war would produce a lot of refugees. So they're like, now is our time to get more Germans to come to Arkansas. And so that was in the early days. And if we can ever survive the rest of this pandemic semester, that is my next project, is looking to see what's going on with the Echo. And then aside from that, I'm working with Linda Jones, who just published a new book on French missionaries in Arkansas, and our colleague, Dr. Ryan Calabretta-Sager, who is a professor of Italian and has also looked at Italian immigrants to Arkansas. We're working on a new project called Mapping Unheard Immigrant Voices, where we are going to try to take all of this phenomenal scholarship that exists about Europeans in Arkansas, all the things you were mentioning at the beginning of this discussion, and we're going to put them in an interactive map where people can see exactly where all of these communities were. And we're going to start to develop digital humanities projects. So for example, one of the first things that got canceled, sadly, in the pandemic was a tour we were going to do of St. Mary's in Altus. Amy Post-Sexton was going to do that for us. And I'm sure a lot of you have been there. That's the German church. You have wonderful stained glass windows and frescoes in German. And so we're going to develop a tour where if you happen to be passing through, you can download this tour and learn about the church as you walk through it. Ryan's got a lot of experience with VR. So we're looking at planning some VR experiences. So for example, you could live a day in the life of the Italian immigrants who were at Sunnyside Plantation and find out all the problems they encountered and why they, in fact, talking about the mosquitoes earlier, why they in fact then ended up in Tommytown and had to move their whole base of operations. So we're really excited about that project. It's just in the beginning stages, but hopefully there's lots more to come with that.
You know, you mentioned earlier Dan Durning, who has done work in German history in Arkansas, particularly in Little Rock. I just recently received my latest issue of the Pulaski County Historical Review. And in there is Dan Durning's article, Pulaski County's German Bohemian Immigrants from Osh, I presume it's pronounced Osh, A-S-C-H, the disruptions of the Civil War years. In other words, he is continuing to look at immigrants from this one area, which had been Bohemia, I believe, at one point. And he's following these folks through time. This is just the latest piece that he's published in the review. Some of his work goes back many decades. So I'm really glad to see Dan Durning using his retirement to produce this wonderful work on Germans in Arkansas.
Absolutely.
Dan is a native of Fort Smith, and he had, in his undergraduate years, he had spent time in, I think it was Vienna, as a Fulbright exchange. And Dan has kept his German skills up and has published a lot.
I was a doctoral student in Vienna, so I'm going to have to maybe disagree that they speak German there, but it's close enough, right?
Excuse me, Kathleen. The book is published by University of Arkansas Press, and it is
Correct.
available. I checked their website before we signed on tonight, and it's actually on sale right now, $29.95, I believe. It's a great deal.
I mentioned that somewhere else. Go to the UA Press because you can get a deal, and I, as a thrifty German, like that a lot. It's $10 more expensive if you go to Amazon.
We do have a question from
Okay.
Cody in Saline County. He's wondering if you came across anything related to Saline County in your research.
That is a great question. And now I'm going to show my bias as a native of Pulaski County and say, can you help me out and tell me like some of the cities in Saline County that you're especially interested in?
Benton,
Bauxite,
Haskell.
Bauxite, yes. I want to say one of the correspondents was either from Bauxite or was reporting news from Bauxite.
There were certainly German speakers in Saline County, for sure.
Didn't Carolyn Billingsley do research on a German community in Saline County, or am I misremembering that?
I don't recall. Like Carolyn Billingsley did some great work on Saline County history.
Cody says, my ancestors, the Stuckeys, were from Hanover, I guess.
Hanover, yeah.
Christopher Columbus Stuckey donated the land where Pine Haven School sits now.
Oh, fascinating.
So I'm
Cool.
sure.
Thanks for sharing that.
Sounds like you already have interested people interested in your next book and your research.
And in the bigger project. Yeah, you know, there's also a great group on Facebook that Joe Huck founded. And they're basically all the descendants of the River Valley Germans. And they've been posting just an amazing diversity of pictures. So for anyone who's interested, that's another place to get more information.
Are you giving a presentation at the Arkansas Historical Association this year?
I am, in fact, yes, with Linda and Ryan.
So you'll be talking about this project that you mentioned?
So I think we're all going to be talking about individual research topics, but yes, absolutely, we will throw in another pitch for that.
So the Historical Association meeting was supposed to be here in Little Rock. It'll be virtual now. I don't know what the registration will be yet, but people should sign up for that and listen to you and Linda and Ryan and the other speakers during the conference. There's always some really fascinating presentations at the Historical Association. We have a question from Blake Winery. Did the German papers take interest in the German-speaking Jews in Arkansas?
Yes, that is a fascinating topic. So the people who founded the Echo were trying to get this paper off the ground when there was already an established paper in Little Rock. So a lot of the heavy hitters were loyal to the Stadtzeitung. They needed advertisers because, of course, although they brought a few subscribers with them from Logan County, they had to have advertisers to make it. And a lot of those advertisers were German Jewish businesses that Carolyn Lemaster talks about in A Corner of the Tapestry. So I think it's safe to say that the Echo might not have made it the first year without those German Jewish businesses advertising. Here's the weird thing. They talk a lot about German Jewish shared kind of like cultural inheritance, shared values. They say that they're interested, you know, in people of all denominations sending in what activities they're doing. But I found a lot of activities in the Jewish community in 1892 that were reported on in the Gazette that were not reported on in the Echo. And I'm not sure where that is. And this is where, if we had extant copies of the Staatszeitung, we might be able to see, you know, were there perhaps more Jewish readers of the Staatszeitung? And so they reported on those activities. So the Echo felt like maybe they didn't need to. I don't know, but I do find it quite puzzling that so many German Jewish organizations supported them through advertising revenue, but they didn't seem to really report on the community at large.
Why do you think that the Subiaco, that the monks at Subiaco saved copies of the Arkansas Echo, but not the Staatszeitung?
Because a lot of the founders were Catholic. I think they were personal friends of them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
We had a, let's see, Shirley says the Staatszeitung went out of business because the then editor Curtis Ackerman was arrested and jailed for sedition.
That's after Phil Dietzken had skipped town. So.
What year was that?
Oh, Shirley, do you remember? It was late 19, 18, 19, sometime in there? I can't remember exactly.
1917.
That's a little off, yeah.
Well, there was a lot of anti-German feeling in 1917.
Sure.
It already started.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for being here. I always enjoy visiting with you. And, you know, the German ancestral community is very small in Arkansas.
It is.
It is. And, you know, I always have to tell this story that Kathleen and I are actually kind of related. But
less than six degrees of separation.
We're God siblings, actually.
Wow.
We share the same godfather. And that was kind of surprise. Well, it wasn't a surprise when we both discovered that, because we were talking and then we just sort of honed in on the same godfather. It was really interesting.
Catholic German circles are pretty small.
They are.
In Arkansas, I mean.
They are.
Not in Cincinnati or
no.
St. Louis,
or Cologne, for that matter. Anyway.
Well, Kathleen, excuse me, thank you again for being here. We're going to wrap up for tonight, but everyone should go out and buy your book from the UA Press website. It's a fascinating book, and we really appreciate you being here tonight. Absolutely. Thanks for the chance to talk. Thank you. Well, I'm going to share my screen again, and just so you'll have the email, if you want to, anyone wants to email us, it's TT with TAT@gmail.com. That stands for Third Thursdays with Tom and Tim @gmail.com. And send us an email. If you have a question, please feel free to do that as well. And we will see you next month in May, the third Thursday in May. And we'll have another interesting presentation, I know.
Do you know who our guest is going to be next month?
I do not. Do you?
No. We would welcome suggestions from our listeners. Actually, we have a list that we go from, or we're supposed to go from. Well, yeah, but it's not solidified. It is not solidified. No, it is not. So, well, thank you all for being here. We will look forward to seeing you next month.